At the Centre for Cities, we focus a lot about the big cities in the UK and how they're performing. We think that matters to the national perspective, to the British perspective, as well as to the places that those big cities represent and are. And transport is one of those big themes, not the only theme, but one of those big themes that we look at, particularly because, in a sense, it's a recognisable policy lever. And very crudely, outside of London, our public transport systems in our big cities are rubbish. That's a technical term for them. In a sense, they are primarily rubbish. Some are worse than others, but all of them, particularly when you compare them to European counterparts, are not very good. In a sense, when I have conversations with European city leaders about public transport and start to talk about how it's organised, they first start laughing because they think you're joking when you start to tell them about how we organise our public transport systems in the UK outside of London. And then they start crying because they realise that you're not lying to them, you're telling them the truth, and they weep for you because they're just very sad and disappointed for you. So there's a kind of common theme or common set of issues on that. And in part, what we tried to do in the report is lay out some thinking and approach. Ellie said, we come at these issues unashamedly and unapologetically from an economy perspective. So that's not to ignore social justice issues or environmental issues or air quality issues or whatever the accessibility issues, whatever they may be, but we start and think about our cities and then their transport systems from an economy perspective. That's really important for us. Otherwise, we can't make much sense of what's going on. And that matters because it matters to the way that we talk about the problem and the opportunities in the report. And the starting point is, this is the Glasgow numbers and this is the Scottish numbers. The big point to make, the economic point to make, like all of Britain's big cities, Glasgow underperforms. There is lost economic potential in and around the Glasgow City region. So I'm going to use Glasgow City region. When I say Glasgow, forgive me, just Glasgow City region is what I'm referring to. There's an underperformance in the Glasgow City region, as there is in Greater Manchester, Greater Leeds, Greater Birmingham, etc. It's unique to Britain. Our big cities don't do as well as their European counterparts. And that really matters because Glasgow's economy, Glasgow City region's economy, is at least 20% of the Scottish economy. So if the Glasgow City region economy doesn't function effectively, that's bad for Glasgow, but it's bad for Scotland, right? In the sense that a big chunk of the country is not doing as well as it would. And it's about 70%. So if you look at the underperformance of the Scottish economy, £10 billion on an annual basis, about £70 billion of that is coming from, £7 billion that is coming out of Glasgow. 70% of the underperformance that we see at the Scottish level is attributed to Glasgow City region. So there's an economy problem that we need to grapple with. And that's the way that we try to think about that. That's why we're interested in public transport, because we think, like other places, public transport is a problem and we can get some wins and gains and benefits if we make the system work more efficiently, more effectively than it currently is. So what's going on in terms of the Glasgow system? So when you think about coverage, so this is basically area covered where you can use public transport to get into the core of Glasgow, into the core area of Glasgow within 30 minutes on a single mode. And when you look at the area that's covered by the Glasgow transport system compared to other British big cities, it does relatively well. Obviously, you can see it's third behind Birmingham and London. So the coverage is pretty good. And that's in part because obviously we're talking about buses, but we're also talking about the subway, and obviously you have a particularly intensive heavy rail system relative to other big cities. So the coverage aspect, the geographical coverage in a British context is pretty good. Remember what I said about British relative to European, right? Because this is important. So in Britain, not so bad. But when we introduce European cities into the mix, and then we look at this coverage question, you can see Glasgow there, the dotted line essentially is Glasgow. You begin to see that there are 44 dots on the chart, and you can see that a significant number of them have a greater coverage than Glasgow has, and only 6, if memory serves me, have below, and some of those are Britain. And so I think that's an important point that we need to think about as well. And there are 3 factors, I think, that we need to hold in our mind when we're thinking about the public transport system and how it works. The first thing is obviously the system itself. I've talked a little bit about that, buses, subway plus heavy rail. That really matters, and it's the nature and shape of it, how it operates. Sorry, I'm standing right in your way. I apologise for doing that. The second thing, which we don't go into in this report, but is a material consideration, is the shape and nature of your urban form. Actually, how your city looks and operates from a housing perspective, from a density perspective, really does matter. Very crudely, you're just thinking about that as passengers or potential passengers, and if they're spread everywhere in all, across all aspects at low density, that presents some particular problems for public transport systems, which is why, not the only reason, but why many of our European cities do relatively well. A, they have a better transport system, but they're enabled to have a better transport system because they live at denser levels. Their housing form, their urban form, allows itself and supports a public transport system. So you've got somewhere like Turin, which is actually, from a network coverage, is below Glasgow. But when you look at the density, there are twice as many people living in the centre of Turin than there are living in Glasgow. And that just creates ideal breeding ground for public transport passengers. So you have to think about that. It's not just providing lots of new and wonderful transport kit. It is also about, are there passengers, and that has implications for housing development, etc., etc. And then the third thing, which again, they do relatively better than us, it's the integration. So it's actually functioning as a system. So it's not having individual bits of the system that essentially function as silos. It's the integrated nature, it's the complementarity. It's being able to get off one mode and onto the next mode because the timing and the scheduling is correct, but also that we have ticketing systems and fare systems that allow all of those kind of things. Again, much more, you see that in much more places than not. So that's the nature of the challenge, nature of the what we're up to. What's the size of the prize? So we're trying to think about now, so we have this public transport system as it is. We think we have some opportunities in relation to the Scotland Act, the Transport Act, to do something about this. So now we're trying to think about how we might estimate, guesstimate, model out some of the prize, the size of the benefits, in order for us to then move forward. And we've used some of the assumptions and some of the that are applied in other places, particularly, but not exclusively, some of the work that Greater Manchester have been doing. And the way we're just trying to think about it, so we're not really focused in the paper about saying we want to add loads more infrastructure, we want to make the transport system much, much bigger. For example, we're not saying we need another 5 Clyde Metros, right? We're almost ignoring that to a degree. We're taking that as part and parcel of it, but we're not saying we need another 5 of those. That's a different point. What we're trying to say is, because of the relationship of the Transport Act in particular, is we're trying to think about and focus on how we might improve the current the system, how the current system works. Can we get more gains out of that? And what we're trying to do then is thinking about existing routes, and to a degree, but only a little bit, about setting new routes. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then we're into thinking about, and when we see the evidence on this, you look at this evidence around public transport usage, frequency really does matter. So literally the number of services, how often they run, let's say on an hourly basis. Reliability, right? You know, no good saying, well, in theory you could get on this bus, but the bus never arrives, or this service never arrives. Complementarity matters. Fares and cost matter, but they matter in relation to the other 3. No good having a cheap service that doesn't turn up, right? Hooray! We can get it for free, but it's not here, right? When you think about that, it's not only about fares, although fares and cost obviously are really quite important. Yet the system at the functional level needs to be operational, and it needs to be able to function around that. So that's what we're trying to think about. That's what in the report, much more detail about some of the assumptions that we make, and then we're trying to get at what that might mean. So the next 3 slides, 2 maps and one then bar chart, is just to give you a sense from that size of the prize type of argument. So this is the urban core of Glasgow. So this is my economy perspective. 45% of the Glasgow City region jobs are in there. 25% of Strathclyde, the broader, bigger Strathclyde area, jobs are in there. It's not the only thing. There are other reasons to travel. I get all of that. But as I said, we're trying to think about how we might marshal and make most of that core. So that's the core element that we're looking at. And then we're saying, given what we know about the system as it currently is, and we think about the geography of reliable, so we're looking at services, do they exist or do they not exist? But we're also interested in whether there's at least a frequency of 4 per hour, right? That's what we're kind of thinking about as our benchmark, again, based on other studies of other cities and other countries. What does that look like? And that's roughly, crudely, what it looks like. And I'm not saying that everybody in that area, right, gets on the bus or gets on the rail. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is a potential current pool, if you call it that, for public transport users. And you can see quite a bit of the built environment of Glasgow is covered, but then it becomes much more patchy as you get out into the city region, some of the authorities that go beyond that. So that's the status quo, and I'll give you a number on that in a second. The second map basically sums together in the purple and adds into what we think could be gained from taking those existing services that are running at frequencies of less than 4 and bringing them up to 4, and by introducing changes into the system that allow modal shift on the journey. So rather than saying you can only make a bus journey or a rail journey or subway journey, you begin to try to identify some of the integration benefits. So frequency benefits and integration benefits, and you can see that the spread of that begins to develop out. And obviously, there are models that we can borrow and learn from Amsterdam and Barcelona, for example, where essentially it's modal blind, but it's up to an hour. So like you can travel on any mode for an hour, but whereas you have some zone cards which allow some things, but there are some. So if you're thinking about that integration and complementarity plus the induced and increased frequency, that's what it looks like. This is saying nothing at the moment about new services. This is existing stuff, just done differently, crudely done better. That's what it looks like. Because in a part, the conversation about new services and reconfiguring the system is not for me. It's for others to decide in the room in terms of what's going on. So that's the geographical or map illustration. Just to give you some numbers. So that is that. So it's about 900,000, give or take, potential passenger pool given the existing system. If you then do the things in terms of increased frequency, better integration, etc., you can increase that pool almost immediately by about 30%. So you're adding another 30% into your potential passenger pool. And again, as I said, this is about existing services, not so much about new services. So the size of the prize is quite significant, even before you start getting into, I guess, more substantive changes in terms of what you want to do. So as I said, we don't really focus on and go into big detail about new services, but we do take an example because I think it's illustrative. So this is again using the same methodology, but now we stick a pin in the hospital. Right, and we look out from the hospital and we say, what's the potential pool? And we know from other surveys, you will all know, access to healthcare, particularly for poorer households and poorer individuals, poorer communities, and those that don't own a car, is a big issue. Constantly told that, being able to access it in good and timely fashion. That's the current pool. If you started to reconfigure that pool and introduce some new services, again, integration and increased frequency, you're making quite significant increases, 66%. So, that's just an example where, thinking about what the benefits of not just adding more frequency and integrating on the existing system, but actually introducing new points of travel from and to. And obviously you could do more of that depending on what you ultimately want to do. And that's what franchising, that's the goal, or that's the ambition, that's the opportunity, I think, with franchising. Because as you know, outside of London, the ability to control the bus systems integrated with other systems is pretty low in every other place in the UK. Manchester is making some moves now, started its franchising process, can go into that in a bit more detail if you like. Liverpool following, Leeds or Greater Leeds, Greater Sheffield will follow suit in due course as well. So there is a kind of franchising opportunity around that. And we do think, we've done some work previously on this more generally, we think it has material advantages compared to the enhanced partnerships or the bus services improvement partnerships, whatever you want to call them, over that. I think there are some significant advantages of franchising offers, not least greater control, but also control over the fare box, which does make a material difference. And we're agnostic, let me be clear. We are agnostic about who owns it. London doesn't own its transport system or its buses, it franchises, right? We're agnostic about that. You want to make arguments about public control, happy days, we're agnostic about doing that. But you can have public control in a franchise system as well. So just say that as well, which you could operate on that. So it's important for me to say that because we are on the record as being relatively agnostic about that. Let me finish just running through some detail on, again, this is the sort of, so what do we think needs to happen? I'll get into the detail in broadly a second and then I'll stop. Let me say four principles that guide our thinking on this. It's really important for us to say this because otherwise what we then say doesn't necessarily, you don't follow the logic. So the first thing is that the issue we're discussing is a national issue. It's not just a local issue. Yes, we're talking about Glasgow City Region, but I've already told you why Glasgow City Region is a national issue. It's not just a local issue. You have to hold that in your head. The second thing is that transport interventions and transport management, etc., definitely need to be integrated with other functions, whether it's planning, whether it's housing, whether it's the economy, whether it's finance. You have to see these things as part of a program, part of a package. Goes back to my previous point as well in terms of how you think about transport, and therefore that has implications as well. The third thing to say, really very, very important, is that there is no optimal bus system, certainly in the UK, possibly not elsewhere, that is financially sustainable on an operational or on a CapEx perspective. London's bus system runs on average an annual loss of about £640 million because it's socially optimal, right? It's not financially optimal, it's socially optimal. It fulfills a bunch of objectives that London decides that it wants and it pays for them. And it's TfL that essentially cross-subsidises the bus system via the tube system, via its commercial development, which relates to my second point. Transport's part of a package rather than seeing it on its own. Because if you think by doing franchising and having this system that suddenly, just from fares and from income associated with revenue associated with fares, that the bus system will cover its face, don't do that, because it's not possible, right? We have to think about how it fits into a broader program. And my fourth and final principle is that there is no perfect solution, right? There are trade-offs and choices and decisions that you need to make. We'll see this in a second when I talk a little bit about institutions, geography, and funding. So that there is no perfect optimal scenario. We're trying to do what we can in order to make best use of it. So very crudely, very quickly. First thing, so we have this legislation. Regulations have been laid, hopefully by the 4th of December. That's what that good news when that happens. But we also have been made aware that there will be further subsequent rounds of regulation needed in order to fully empower the first lot of regulation. No delay on that. Manchester has been at franchising for 7 years. Sooner you start, the sooner you get it. Liverpool will take less time. Leeds will take less time again. Sheffield will take less time again, but it takes a while. So the longer we delay, the longer it takes before we get the rewards and the benefits that we need. So we need those regs, the first round of regs in December, but we need the second round of regs as early as we can get them in 24. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, we think that SPT should be the lead organisation. Because, one, it's an actual organisation, right? This is my perfect solutions, right? It's an actual organisation and it has some capacity in this stuff. It runs services, it does the subway, etc., right? So you have to start with where you are in terms of what the institution is. So the SPT exists, it has some capacity and experiences. We need to move forward and use that existing institution. I know that there are other plans about some other things, but we are just being pragmatic about that. There may be some phasing that is required because obviously SPT geography is much bigger than GCR geography. We get all of that. So there may be some phasing that needs to come in. That's what's happening in Greater Manchester. It's not beyond us on that. But institutional capacity does really matter. You have an institution that is well placed to do that. That's why we make the argument or we make the case for SPT to be doing that. And the third thing is, again, fits to my principles, the Scottish Government will need to be an active partner in this process and will need to be providing some funding. There is no two ways around this. If you look at the GM model and you look at what's going on in England, crudely and roughly, when you look at the big cities and the transport systems in there, the government, to varying degrees, is in on these things for about 70% of the costs. The other 30% comes from the locality through different sources. We can discuss that. But the government needs to be involved in that. And the argument why the Scottish Government should be involved in that is because Glasgow matters massively to the Scottish Government, or at least it should, right, from an economy point of view, because that's where all of this stuff is kind of happening. So these kind of things happen and work together. So we have to think about Scottish Government being involved. And we're saying in the first years 1 to 5, there are transition costs that vary and there are operational costs. You can't get away from that, moving from one system to the other, but government will need to be involved in that. In years 5 to 10, so the second tranche of this 10-year deal that you should see it as, in that second period, in years 5 to 10, this is where we then need to think seriously about the role that local partners are going to play from a funding perspective. And what we're saying in the report, there are opportunities and there are potential possibilities there. All of them, I appreciate, can be challenging and difficult, different modes of raising cash, whether it's council tax precepts, whether it's workplace parking levies, whether it's congestion charging, whatever it is, there are lots of opportunities, lots of possibilities that are being used in various ways in other cities in the UK and certainly across the mainland continent. But the point is, we need to get to a system where Scottish Government is involved as a partner, but also that local partners are involved from a funding point of view. That really is quite important in order to do that. And depending on what those funding sources might ultimately be from the locality, that will have further implications for SPT as an institution. And the ability to, if it was to raise revenues itself, or indeed to be the recipient of it, then there are knock-on effects from an institution and a governance perspective, which we touch on in the report that SPT would need to grapple with, and the partners of SPT would equally need to grapple with. And then finally, once we get some of that, is we're thinking about that sort of longer run, which again you see in elsewhere, is then that being the bedrock or the foundation to really think about devolving and integrating the rail system more fully into the operational considerations and the investment considerations at that geography level. So thinking about what the future of heavy rail is and how and the stations that are obviously part of that system, the degree to which they are then part of the transport system and perform transport functions, but increasingly also perform other functions, whether it's commercial activity or residential activity or other economic activity. So that's the sort of thinking and the phasing that we've done, and it has implications for roles and responsibilities. So a quick gander through. I hope that's been useful and maybe even interesting. I don't know. But what I've tried to do in the presentation, Lisa, and we try to do it in the report, is set out a way of thinking about these issues as well as what we think about the issues. And if you disagree with one, you may well disagree with two and such. But I'm trying to give you a sense as to why we've said what we've said, as well as what we've said. So hopefully that's useful. Open it up to questions. I'll take questions, reflections, things we've got obviously wrong, things we've got marginally right, but any reflections at all, much appreciated.